Hey guys, this is Deji from VMware. Deji runs everything that I know in Active Directory at VMware, but he also does SQL and some other fancy Microsoft stuff. You do SAP as well, right?
That's not Microsoft.
That's not Microsoft? Mm-mm. I'm getting confused with all those partnerships.
Now, if you call it SAP, then we can say it's Microsoft.
Oh yeah, then okay, yeah.
So,
Yeah.
Yep. MS SAP.
Right. And I'm just a senior consultant. I'm now a chief technology officer at SCCT. We're a small consultancy company, I guess, organization in the Netherlands. And Deji used to be a buddy Microsoft MVP before I got awarded MVP. I'm now an 11-year MVP.
And then I'm like, well, they just give MVP to everybody now.
Yep.
And I'm out.
Yep.
So it's, I mean, come on, it was supposed to be exclusive. And then it became one.
I bought Windows Server 2018, 2002, and I got my MVP. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, that's how they do it now?
That's how they do it now.
Cheers.
Yep. I'm also a Veeam Vanguard. If you went to Nicola's session yesterday, you probably have an idea what that is. The session is already ready for playback, so if you want to view that, go ahead. And I've become a VMware V expert. That's the one they give to everybody. Last year for presenting at VMworld. All right. So Deji is basically from a different generation, directory services guys than I am. Deji is trying to reintroduce the rubber chickens at VMworld. This is a directory experts conference gimmick from about 15 years ago.
It's not a gimmick.
Okay. And we are giving away small ones for people that ask smart questions. Okay, we shouldn't set the bar that high, right? That ask questions, that give us remarks, that raise their hands. This guy wants a chicken bad.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Perhaps if we have one left.
I think down the street they have Kentucky Fried Chicken. You could make do with that.
And we are good to go, I guess.
Yes, and comedy show is over. Thank you for coming. The exit is that way. All right, let's get serious. My name is Deji Akomolafe. In the daytime, I'm a solutions architect for VMware. I won't tell you what I do at night. And that's my colleague. So what I do for VMware is spend VMware's money to help you figure out what to do and what not to do when you virtualize Microsoft applications on vSphere. I live and breathe Microsoft applications on vSphere. My team publishes most of the best practices, well, if not all the best practices you see on our website, the KBs, and everything that has to do with virtualizing Microsoft applications on vSphere. I look intelligent. I can't promise you that I am. The reason I'm able to talk about things I do is because I talk to people like you. Tell me what your pain points are. I go back inside to my engineers. I tell them this is what my people are feeling, and then the engineers go into wherever they do their magic. They make the product better. They tell me this is what we do. Go and look smart. And then I come to you and I tell you how it is supposed to work. And then you're looking at me and, oh, he's a good guy, very smart guy. That's me. And thank you for coming.
Well, at least you look intelligent and you dress smart. But yeah, I don't have that going for me. But I'm from the Netherlands, so I'm from Europe. This is VMware to Europe. So I've got that going for me. It also explains my weird accent because I'm from the Netherlands, where we do all kinds of stuff, right? Like lose soccer games, I guess. Anyway, and I'm the CEO at SCCT, and we're a small consultancy company in the Netherlands, and we do Microsoft stuff as well. We're going to talk to you today about virtualizing Active Directory the right way.
No, we're not. We're going to read the EULA, and you're going to all sign, and then I'm going to tell the lawyers that I did my job, and I've done my job. So now.
Deji, we only have 55 minutes. Just reading the end user license agreement is like 3 hours.
It's over. I'm done.
Okay.
Go.
Not the entire EULA. Okay. Okay, so we're going to show you why we think it's the best thing to do with Active Directory to virtualize it. Is there anybody in this room that still has physical domain controllers? Cool.
Whoa.
We don't have that many chickens. Sorry. I'm expecting that. Dejin is not expecting that because he's been writing this incredible documentation on why you can virtualize Active Directory, and we're going to tell you why. We're going to show you the 3 pillars of information security, so confidentiality, integrity, and availability, and how these are impacted or improved even if you run domain controllers virtually in this session. And we still have 15 minutes left, so let's get started.
Now, please, I know you are all smarter than I am, even though he says address well. This is not an Active Directory class because I don't want to pretend to know much about Active Directory or more than you do. We are not going to teach the basics of Active Directory. Everything we are going to show you from this point on is what exactly in Active Directory we want to make you be more conscious of what you do with your domain controllers when you put them in a virtual environment, specifically on the vSphere platform. We are not going to get into AD 101. We will get a little bit technical, and we are setting the premise for what's coming next, so that when we start showing you some things, you can relate it to, okay, why are they talking about these things? You will know why we're talking about what we're talking about. Also, I need to apologize. I'm going to get out of here very quickly because I have an overlapping session, but my colleague has volunteered to split himself into 2, virtualize himself or clone himself, and he's going to speak for me after I've left. I apologize. Third, we are going to show you demos.
2 of them.
We don't do canned demos because as technical resources, we hate that. We want to actually show you live what it is that we are doing, because when we tell you that if you do X, Y, Z, it's going to do some bad things to your enterprise, we want you to be able to actually see it and not as a video. Does that make sense? That, sir, everybody, is why we have the chickens, because we have to sacrifice some chicken to the demo gods to be with us. We would not be able to do all the demos today because of the time constraint and 1 hour. However, what we did is we insisted on a repeat of this session. Now, we have 4 hours, or we're less than 50 minutes now here for this. Tomorrow, we have all day being 4 hours. We will get bloody. If you are not the squishy type, if you don't hate blood, if you don't hate gores, please come to the next session tomorrow. We will get into all the destructive AD demos that will show you how you can really screw up your enterprise and your forest. All right? Thank you. Okay, let's start.
Yep.
We asked what was the most important domain controllers in the enterprise. There really isn't one. There's no most important domain controller in any forest, tree, or domain. Why? Because domain controllers are interchangeable.
Well, all domain controllers are created equally, but some are more equal than others.
The one that is more equal than the other, if that decides to take his toys or her toys and go away, it's easily replaceable. We can always seize roles. So your PDCE today, that appears to be the most important in your enterprise, if it decides that it doesn't want to play with you anymore, it can say, go, and I'll get another PDCE. Every one of them is important. Every one of them is equally important. They do one thing and one thing only: keep your enterprises up, replicate changes, converge changes, and they let your people be able to log in, do what they need to do, your applications to work, do what it needs to do. Now, because of the multi-master operation design of Active Directory, If any one of them is not functioning, we can get rid of it. Writes originate from any domain controller in the enterprise, except the RODC. So you do not need one domain controller to be available in order for you to do some operations. We will get to the exceptions. Schema update masters, or the schema roles, are a little bit special, because if you want to do schema updates, you need them. Now, if they're not available, we seize the role. We can always have a schema master. As long as you have more than one domain controller in your enterprise, no one is better than the other or more important than the other. That was a trick question, and I think I failed it during.
It was a chicken question.
A chicken question, okay.
Yep.
Now,
Trick question.
each domain controller in your enterprise does replication by selecting partners. They don't all replicate among each other. Imagine if you have a large global enterprise of AD. You don't expect your 200 domain controllers to be chatting and talking to each other. So they do selective replication. Okay, I can get to you really fast. All right, I will replicate to you, and you can replicate to the other guy, and the other guy can replicate to the other guy. So you have a mesh, right? Okay. There are some additional complexity in this multi-master scenario I described to you. For example, the infrastructure master being on the global catalog. Again, not AD 101, but those are just the little exceptions why you may say, okay, domain controllers are not equal. Intrinsically, they are.
So let's go back to 1997. And that's a long way back, I understand. But the Active Directory team had to come up with a model that must have been better than NT4. NT4 had PDCs that were writable, BDCs that were non-writable. Everything originated from a PDC and then was replicated to a BDC. That was a really faulty model. And then there was a couple of smart people, we weren't there, obviously, that invented the Active Directory replication model. And we can go through the details on these slides, but there's a couple of things that I want you to know. You can safely change the IP address of a domain controller, because it's not on this slide. An IP address doesn't matter. Domain controller name, you can just rename a domain controller as long as it's not a certification authority as well. And it doesn't matter for replication, because it's not on the list on this slide. What is a couple of, well, GUIDs and IDs and stuff like that. Because everything under the hood in Active Directory replication is performed not by a domain controller, but by the DSA GUID that represents the domain controller. And that GUID doesn't change. That is something that it lives and it dies with that domain controller. And there's the second thing, and that's the invocation ID. And this thing is the one that is actually the address of replication partners. So if I'm a domain controller, let me just, yep, I'm there. I'm a domain controller. I want to replicate to another domain controller. I'm just going to go to DNS, find the invocation ID, and then replicate to that domain controller. Now the fun part is that an invocation ID can change, and there's good reasons why you might want to change the invocation ID for a domain controller. And I'll show you in one of our, well, rather funky animations in the next slide. But first let me check the update sequence number, the USN. And this is a logical clock. Every domain controller that does a write, when it performs the write into the database, it will update the USN with the amount of writes that it does. So if I'm at 500, I do a write, I'm now at 501. Your domain controllers can have different USNs. No problem. And the USN only goes up in the world of Active Directory. And that's funny, because this is something that, when we virtualize domain controllers, is something that can really mess up our domains. And timestamps, well, people used to think that timestamps are really important, and well, they are until a certain extent for authentications and stuff like that. But for domain controller replication, it's only important if you have multiple teams in multiple geographical locations making changes to the same objects in Active Directory, because the timestamp is only used when there's a conflict in replication, and then the last write wins. Now let me show you what that looks like under the hood. So I think I've been very creative. I've created 2 vSphere hosts. You can see the resemblance, right? And they have a logical clock, they both have a domain controller. So there's a domain controller on your left, and there's a domain controller DC2 on the right. By the way, DC1 is the most common server name for Windows servers globally. They've actually researched that. Pretty cool, right? And those virtual machines are represented by the files on the disk or the storage of the vSphere hosts. Now, there's always in Active Directory those pesky end users, right? Well, let's have Service Desk cover all that. But if I have a device, it would just communicate to the closest domain controller. And that's something that we govern with Active Directory sites. And if we look at the unique serial number, what we see in this picture is that they are different. We have a DC1 with a USN of 400, and we have a DC2 with a USN of 270. Now what happens is, when we replicate, each domain controller knows the USN of the other replication partner. This is funny if you have multiple replication partners. They all have knowledge of the USN of all the replication partners. Pretty cool. And that's stored in the high watermark table. So each domain controller knows the USN of all its replication partners. That's important. And if I create 12 objects on DC1, you can see the USN go up to 412. And then if we replicate those over, you can see that the unique serial number for DC2 is up by 12, and that it now knows that the for the invocation ID of DC1, that the USN was 412 at the last time of replication. Now if I create another user on DC2, replicate that over, you see the entire game continue. And yes, there's a lag in the USN knowledge of the partners, and that's by design, because we have change notifications and stuff like that. Cool. So now that we have this knowledge, which is basically all the Active Directory knowledge that we're sharing with you today, and we are going to share way more information with you tomorrow if you're in that session, we can now have a couple of best practices for replication between domain controllers. So even if you know what you're doing, Deji and I found out that you probably don't. So please stick with the defaults unless you've really, really, really tested it through and through your development, test, and acceptance environments, that this is the behavior that you want to see. If not, just stick with bridge all site links. If not, stick with the automatically configured replication partnerships. And of course, take care of proper networking and Active Directory domain and site design, because the way you design your Active Directory domains and the way you design your Active Directory sites governs replication in Active Directory.
So why would you want to virtualize Active Directory? Or why are some people not virtualizing Active Directory? One, it is what the cool guys are doing today. Virtualized first is now a common standard in most enterprises. Virtualization itself is no longer black magic. It's not esoteric anymore. And Active Directory virtualization is fully supported, and we are going to show you some of the features that actually backs that up. It is virtualization friendly. Most of the hardware you're buying today are too powerful, too big for a domain controller. And since you can have two domain controllers, controller instances on the same physical hardware, buying a 20-core or 36 or 48, or what do they have now? 80-core system just to put AD on it, a DC on it, is a waste of money. So it is actually very virtualization friendly and performs identically. The characteristics itself are virtualization friendly. It's distributed, multi-master, low I/O. You don't really need a lot of resources for Active Directory or for a domain controller. A single DC cannot utilize all the resources you have on modern hardware.
Just to give an example, just a normal organization with about 5,000 users has an Active Directory database of about 30 MB. Where can you find disks of 30 MB, physical disks of 30 MB, right? You can't. I think the smallest size is 300 gigs at the moment. You have to make two to have a mirror, a RAID 1 set. So you're wasting resources, even on disks.
So we all know that you are in this room because you have one or two things to do with the Active Directory infrastructure in your enterprise. We all know that if that becomes unavailable, a lot of things stop, if not everything. Your users can log in, you have Exchange servers, it's telling you, I don't know what I am doing here because I can't find a domain controller. And because of the distributed nature of the operations master's role, we expect that you will deploy more than one domain controller. Is there anybody in this room who has only DC1 and nothing else?
This does not earn you a chicken, by the way.
No, it doesn't actually penalize you because
there's no hands. Cool.
Okay, thanks. There is nothing special between a virtualized domain controller from operational perspective or from what you would do normally to a domain controller and a virtualized one. There are things you do on the virtualization layer and platform to make it better, but there is no administrative overhead or differences between a virtualized DC and a physical DC. If you actually know that you have virtualized a DC, then you've done something wrong. There is no reason why you should know that a DC is running on physical server or on virtual environment. For that reason, when you look at the best practices for virtualized domain controllers on vSphere, there is nothing technical in that document that says Microsoft says this, we say this. Okay? Now, general best practices, deploy more than one, distribute the roles over multiple domain controllers. The first one you deploy definitely has all the 5 operation masters role. We will encourage you to move 1 or 2 off to other domain controllers so that if you lose one, you don't lose all those roles at the same time, even though we know that you can seize them. Follow the Microsoft guidance on operation masters or FISMO role placement.
So Deji, what if there's people in this room that have physical domain controllers and they want to virtualize them? They want to perhaps P2V them? Is that something that...
we're going to get to that.
Okay.
But just to answer that quickly, good friends don't let friends P2V a domain controller.
Quick enough, right?
Okay?
Cool.
All right. So deploy more, don't have only one, distribute the roles. Now, in a virtualized environment or on vSphere, we make it very easy for you to avoid what do you call it, egg in one basket situation. So if you have multiple domain controllers, we ask you to apply anti-affinity rules so that no 2 domain controllers land on the same ESX host. Because if you lose one ESX host, you lose a lot of domain controllers. So use anti-affinity rule, use it liberally, keep all your domain controllers separate on different ESX hosts. Again, eggs in one basket. Yes. P2V, don't.
So as a company, we do a lot of Active Directory health scans, and most of the time we see that organizations are lucky to have domain controllers run on different vSphere hosts. Are you using anti-affinity rules today for your domain controllers?
If you're not, please do.
Oh, yes, and we don't have that many chickens. So that was a good question.
All right, so virtualizing domain controllers is easy. It's not black magic, but why do people still not do it? I saw a bunch of hands from people who haven't virtualized domain controllers. Maybe they haven't virtualized everything, or they've not virtualized some. Probably the PDC emulator is what they've not virtualized. I can tell you why most people don't virtualize the PDC emulator. We'll talk about that as the first thing on this bullet. Timekeeping. We have demos and we have slides to that. Okay. Some people say it deviates from our build practice process. That's actually counterintuitive because you can template your VMs the way you want, and you can easily have a standard and force rules and how you want them to be, and that's what you get when your domain controller admin or your AD admin comes to ask you for a VM for a DC. So it actually improves standardization and not the other way around. Keeping an AD VMworld PDC emulator because, again, we don't want to mess with it. We'll talk about it. Privilege escalation used to be a fear, a very real fear back in the days when we started virtualizing domain controllers. Yes, somebody can just go in, get the VMDK, and now they have the date, and now they can go replay it. That was a very valid fear. We don't have that anymore. We will talk about that in demos and subsequent slides. The fear of the stolen VMDK is the same thing also. For the escalations, I don't want my vCenter admin to become a domain admin. That doesn't happen. Just because your vCenter admin can see your domain controllers doesn't make them domain admin. If they don't have privileges to log into your DC, if they're not part of the group that you are allowed to manage AD, just because they can see it doesn't mean that they can do anything with it. Yes, they can steal the VMDK, but we also have a solution to that problem.
Yep. So just a quick question. When you work in an organization, perhaps you do, with more than 5,000 users, and you are both the domain admin, or the enterprise admin perhaps even, and the virtualization admin, please raise your hand. Okay, 10,000 users. 3 chickens, 4 chickens. All right, keep your hands up. You're the real heroes here. That's 1. Good job, because you still have a job. Sorry, 5? Oh, definitely a hero.
1 million. We have 1 million here.
Now everybody, there was only 5 hands showing initially.
Go ahead.
So if we are going to address all these 5 fears, no problem. But what we've done in this deck is we've chosen to do that in 3 pillars. So we are going to use the 3 pillars of information security, which is confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Yes, if you abbreviate that shortly enough, you get CIA, which is also something that is easy to remember.
We're not saying NSA. We don't mention NSA here.
They don't have a model like this, so no, we don't. So let's look at integrity.
CIA.
So let's look at integrity first, right? Let's start with proper time. Because it's funny. So I already mentioned to you guys that time is only of essence in Active Directory replication when you have conflicting rights. But there's more to that story. There's actually 3 different stories. So the first one is that Active Directory leverages W32 time, which is a service on every Windows host, and they all interact with each other if there's multiple domain controllers, multiple domains, multiple forests, multiple servers, multiple devices, stuff like that. And what you see is that there's a hierarchy. So if I'm the PDC emulator of the forest root domain, the first domain that was created in a root doesn't have to be actually in the top of the domain namespace anymore. then everything synchronizes to me. But if we do that in a really large environment, what you see is that the load on that PDC emulator would be too big for, well, normal physical hardware at least, to accommodate that. So the Active Directory team, years and years ago, have begun thinking up this hierarchy. And there's PDC emulators in child domains or subdomains that actually synchronize their time to the PDC in the root domain. There's domain controllers in the root domain that synchronize to the PDC emulator in their own domain. There's clients that synchronize to domain controllers and the PDC emulator. So this is all divided into domains. But ultimately, the PDC emulator in the forced root domain is responsible and is, or should be, the reliable time source in your network. There's another thing that's also interesting, and I've actually encountered this myself. We were working with a company, and they have 3 domain controllers, physical. I'm talking about 2005, right? Don't judge me. They have 3 physical domain controllers, and they have a 4th hardware device, same hardware, no disks. And if one of the motherboards would fail of that server, that was a common fabrication mistake in that server. I won't name any vendors. If one of those 3 domain controllers would fail, they would just take out the servers, put them in the 4th server, and start them up. And actually it did. But the fun part is that they forgot to set the time on the firmware of the 4th device. And of course, the PDC emulator failed. So everything was synchronized to a bad host. And actually, what happens is that some of those hosts that synchronize time went over the 48-hour time limit that W32 time insists upon. So we were in a hot mess. And that's actually the day that I learned everything there was to know about time synchronization in Active Directory. And yes, I'm proud of that today. Not so much then. But you can use the registry entries right there, and there's a Microsoft support article that helps you to do that. And of course, Kerberos authentication fails if you have time differences over 5 minutes. So let's look at what that looks like in our neat little animations. So we have 2 people, 2 devices, and they're connected to different domain controllers. And both domain controllers are configured to synchronize time with the vSphere hosts. Yep. And because the devices are synchronized time with the domain controllers, we are basically all synchronized time with the time clocks of the vSphere hosts. And everything is okie dokie. But what if one of the clocks is bad? What you'll see is that everything synchronizes through and through, everything fails, and there's one person that wants to authenticate to another domain controller and is probably saying, why can't I authenticate? Right? This is what happens if you do time sync for domain controllers with vSphere hosts. And there's different ways that you could configure this. So if you look at the time settings for a virtual machine, what you see is that there's a little checkbox that you can say, that you can check that says, please synchronize time. Well, that checkbox is pretty short, but there's more to it. And Knowledge Base article 1189 describes all that.
Okay, let me add something to that, because we stopped doing that several years ago by default. So now when you create your VM, we don't automatically sync it with the host. And if you have done that before, you could just go and uncheck the box. Life is good, right? No. Because even though we don't automatically sync your VM clocks to, through this GUI to a host anymore, there are some operations you perform on a regular basis in a vSphere environment on your VM where everything is good according to you because you haven't checked that box. If you perform those operations, we will still silently go and do some things to the VM clock. Now, if you are in a scenario where the host on which that VM is has a bad clock, when you perform any of those actions, any of these actions we list here, we will sync that VM's clock to the host, even though that box is unchecked.
Shall we demo?
Yes, let's do some demo.
Finally, right?
I have 2 VMs here. This is going to be quick, painless.
Well, painless for one of them, at least.
So what you're looking at here, you look at the clock. I think we have identical, almost, right? And these VMs are on the same host. And what we're going to do, we're just going to migrate them, vMotion them. vMotion operation is one of the operations that impacts VM clocks. So that's easy for us to demo. If you're looking at this host here, we intentionally make this host clock really, really, really bad. If I can't see but you can see up there. And we stopped external time sync, so we're not syncing with any NTP anywhere. So we know that this host here has a bad time. And these VMs are all happy right now because they have good time and they're syncing. What we're going to do is we're just going to intentionally move these 2 VMs from one host to this bad host. So please bear with me. That's one. It's password 1, 2, 3. Oops, sorry.
Nope. Everything's going passwordless anyway, so it doesn't matter.
All right, so we are moving this VM to a host that we know to be bad. In a short while, it should show up that it's been moved. Come on now. Thinking about it. Okay. While it's thinking about that, I'm going to go and do the second one just to speed up the process. We're moving another VMs to the same host. This time we expect some things to happen to this VM.
Yeah.
So 2 VMs. Wait, what happened?
It's getting there. Just show the desktops. Oop.
Forget it. We'll do the manual way.
Okay. If you have a chicken, this would be a good time to sacrifice it to the demo gods. Phil waiting for data?
Yeah.
All right.
Okay, the gods did not accept the chicken. All right, what would have happened? We would have moved the 2 VMs to the same host, and we know that the host has a bad clock. What you will see is that client 1, the first VM, doesn't change its time. The second one changed its time. And why is that? Why is that is because since the unchecked box doesn't do the magic anymore, and since there are some operations that you can do on a VM that will change the clock, we have...
That one?
Yeah.
Cool.
So we have these advanced configuration options that you can either add directly to the VMX file, or you can add through the GUI, or you can script PowerShell, or you can use any of the scripting tools to inject into a VM. If these are set, it could be either 0 or false. Tool sync time equal false, or tool sync time equal 0. With this, those VMs would never be impacted by wrong or bad clock on a host anymore, regardless of what operations you perform on them. That is what we're trying to demo here. Go ahead, please.
Why does, when you make the VM, the vMotion, why change or check the box that was unchecked before? Why
we didn't check the box. We don't check the box.
You don't check the box, but you said that it looks, the time is being taken.
Yes, it does. Because of the way we do vMotion, because of the way we do the operation. For example, when we do vMotion, we actually copy the state of the VM, and when we finish copying it, we power it on the other host that we're moving it to, right? When we power it on, it inherits the time, the clock of that VM. It's not a bug, it's a feature. And we're saying, if you don't want that to happen, put this in. Once you put this in, that would not happen anymore.
Okay.
All right.
But this all changed with Windows Server 2016 because Windows Server 2016 has a new algorithm for checking time with W32 time. So if you use the left scenario to work together, then please make sure that you check that scenario if you use Windows Server 2016 or Windows Server 2019 as domain controllers, because these are the 3 changes that you need to be aware of with these new operating systems. And we've added this specifically because we know some of you will probably be migrating Windows Server 2008 and 2008.2 domain controllers in the next couple of months. Cool. Well, we've did the live demo. Let's talk about USN rollback, because this is something that we see a lot in virtualized environment. And if you, sorry, want to take a picture of that one?
No, that's fine.
Okay, cool. If we look at virtualized environments, and if we look at the DSA GUIDs and the invocation ID and the USN, what we see is that in 1997, the Active Directory team did not have the notion of virtualization, and that is correct, because no one was virtualizing domain controllers or NT4 servers at that time, so there was no reference to that. But the entire working of the USN is something that, if you virtualize domain controllers, is something that might hurt you as a domain admin. So DC1 and DC2 both know about the other virtual machines and the high watermark table and the USN. So if I create a couple of users, what happens is that the USNs are changed, and that we now know that the high watermark table tells us that the USN is 110 if we replicate that, because DC2 will actually pick that up. And when we replicate it, it will actually write that back into that high watermark table. Now, if I create a couple of users after a VM snapshot, for instance, what you see is that there's DC1, and it is back to a former USN. And now, if I create 10 or more users, I have a different USN, and what happens is DC2 will happily take those users. Because it, well, will it? Or won't it? It will if there's nothing there that prevents that domain controller. So now what we have is duplicate users, or users that exist on one domain, or users that exist on another domain, or stuff like that. Because if we revert that snapshot, what you see is that 120 is now something that is different in the replication at DC2 than what it was before, at the last synchronization. So if we try to synchronize that, then DC2 will actually say, you know what? I know you had a higher USN when we last replicated, so we're not going to do that. Because if we are going to do that, if we are going to let these replications happen, what we're doing is we're recreating a scene from one of Deji and I favorite Marvel movies. We're basically going to do this. We're going to delete half of everything. Well, actually everything that is in that USN bubble.
And what happens after that is that any subsequent update from this domain controller whose USN has been rolled back will never be accepted by any other domain controller in the enterprise. Which is why sometimes you will find your users trying to log in into your enterprises or your application trying to use that domain controller for some authentication or for some other operations, and it will never succeed because nobody else is talking to that domain controller from that point on. That is one of the reasons why you want to be very careful in your virtualization of your domain controllers.
Yes. So what can we do to prevent USN rollbacks? Well, it's pretty easy. We just don't revert to snapshots. Well, that's not an acceptable answer in most organizations. So if we don't revert to snapshots, then there must be something else that we can do. Well, there is. And the answer to that is to use Windows Server 2012, for instance. But if we don't use snapshots, we can always use Active Directory aware backup solutions. And VMBNR, for instance, is a solution that will reset the invocation ID. And just think about that, right? We've talked about the DSA GUID, we talked about the invocation ID, we talked about the USN. If I reset the invocation ID, what actually happens is there's a new replication partner. That domain controller that I just restored or that I just reverted is going to say, hi everybody, I'm a new domain controller, please replicate in. Everything you thought was from me originating, yeah, that was that other guy, that other invocation ID. That wasn't me. It's Shaggy all over. Wasn't me. Just replicate in and let's keep the entire integrity for Active Directory. And of course, there's the RID pool as well. So if you revert or if you restore a domain controller, make sure that the RID pool master is available for that. And of course, the most important tip that we give to Active Directory admins today is to monitor Active Directory replication. There's repadmin, which is built in, but command line. It's really cool. There's some PowerShell commandlets starting in Windows Server 2016 as well. And of course, there's the Active Directory replication tool. So the second thing that we see happening in environments is lingering objects. And for this one, you need to know that if we have a completely, perfectly replicating Active Directory environment, what happens is if I create a snapshot and then I just delete a user, then that user is replicated over. But we can't just delete the user because we won't be able to tell the other domain controllers what user I just deleted, right? I just deleted the user. Okay, what was his security identifier? I don't know, I just deleted the user, I can't look it up anymore. So what we do is we actually tombstone deletions. And when we replicate these tombstones, there's a process local on every domain controller, which is the garbage collection process, that actually waits for a couple of days, 60 days if you have a really old Active Directory before Windows Server 2003, and else it's 180 days. And now, if the garbage collection process has run, what we see is that the user is actually deleted from the database and everything's peachy. Now let's revert a snapshot. And what you'll see is that the user is back. The user was perfectly replicated. Everything's cool. We didn't create a user. The domain controller that we reverted says, I never deleted anything. All the other domain controllers don't even know the object anymore. So what you get is an object that only lives, a lingering object that only lives on DC1. And again, we'll have a user that, for instance, is able to log on sometimes if looking at the right domain controller. So what can you do to prevent and remediate lingering objects? Well, don't disable strict replication, because strict replication will actually tell domain controllers to perform deletions within 30 days and not do any funky stuff anymore. And if you have lingering objects, then there's the lingering objects liquidator that is easily remembered, because the one thing that you won't do if you have lingering objects is to laugh out loud, right? LOL. And you can use that. Now there's another feature in Windows Server 2012 that is virtualization safer Active Directory. And this is based on a Microsoft invention called the VM Generation ID. And the VM Generation ID is there in Hyper-V, it's in vSphere 5.0, Service Pack 2 and up. And we actually see that even Xen Server has it now. And what we're seeing is that a domain controller that lives on a VM Generation ID capable platform will actually get that VM Generation ID stuffed into its virtual memory. And in a domain controller, an Active Directory is the only role that actively uses the VM Generation ID in memory, will check the VM Generation ID that it caches at every write. So what happens is, with the VM Generation ID, and there's an entire white paper on this, is that after a revert or restore, the VM Generation ID from the point of view of the VM Generation ID capable platform is changed. Now if a domain controller wants to write to the database and performs the check, it will say, you know what, these two values don't match up, so I'm just not going to do anything. So now if we revert a snapshot on a VM Generation ID capable platform with a domain controller that runs Windows Server 2012 or up, what we're actually seeing is that that snapshot is handled gracefully. Active Directory will actually say, you know what, I've detected a snapshot, it's over. We are first going to have to fix this before we do anything else. Now, the one thing that you should ask yourself with domain controller safeguards is, now that you can do snapshots, should you take snapshots? And I think that that is something that you, well, probably should not, but there's a couple of things that we want to just share with you. And even though you can do snapshots, it's better to take backups, and snapshots are not backups.
I do apologize. I sincerely apologize, but I have to be somewhere else. I hope you understand, and I hope you bear with me. I apologize again. I'll see you tomorrow. You have 4 hours with me.
Yep.
You have Sandra.
I'll still take it away for 5 or 10 more minutes. Yep, thank you, Deji. So let's look at the second pillar, right? Ensuring Active Directory availability. And the fun part is that that same VM Generation ID can be used to perform domain controller cloning. And this is funny, because if I have a domain controller and it knows when it's reverted, then we can also give it some more information and tell, you know what, you're being cloned. From the the virtualization platform point of view. So not from a storage point of view, not from a guest point of view, but from a platform point of view. We can tell a domain controller, you know what, we love you so much, we created another one of you. And it just works if you run Windows Server 2012 or up. Well, it doesn't just work. There's a couple of things that you need to know. And the first thing is that the RIT-master FISMA role cannot be cloned and should be available. If you clone a domain controller, please make sure it doesn't hold any operation roles. And you have to give it a file, and we'll show you tomorrow how to do that. And if you use, you can do that, right? You have a domain controller, you can actually make a template of that and use it to clone domain controllers for, well, 30 days until strict replication kicks in. So you can do that, but you have to give it a file that says, you know what, this is your new name, this is your IP addresses, and you can all give it that sort of stuff. If you use it as a template, don't use these parameters, because if you don't, what will happen is that Active Directory will actually create new names for new domain controllers. So if you have a template that's DC, then you can have a DC 001, 002, 003 with auto naming just like that. And of course, if you clone a domain controller, do not perform guest customization because it breaks the entire stuff. So what are the best practices? Well, run 5.0 update 2 or up, run Windows Server 2012 or up. There's a clonable domain controllers group. So for the majority of you guys that are not both enterprise admins and virtualization admins, Active Directory admins are still in charge of actual domain controller cloning, because if the domain controller is not part of or member of the clonable domain controllers group, it will not clone, even though the hypervisor admin has done everything he or she could to do so. There's one more thing. It needs to be set to, I think it's VM version 7 on the virtualization platform as well. If it's not, it won't clone anyway, because the VM generation ID is not passed to the operating systems for lower VM versions. And of course, it has some impact on disaster recovery, because if you're not aware of DC cloning, then what happens is that you actually end up with servers that are not restored but cloned. So you don't want that. Looking at Active Directory tamper-proofing, the solution is VM encryption. And this was the question that I asked regarding the no-crypt admin, because in Windows Server, we now have a feature, well, it's not in Windows Server, I'm sorry. In vSphere, we now have the ability to do VM encryption. We can encrypt the configuration of a virtual machine, and then we have no crypt admins that cannot access that VM anymore. In Windows Server 2016 and 2019, it's called Shielded Virtual Machine for Hyper-V, and it uses the same technology, virtualization-based security, and it's been extensively documented on the VMware blogs as well. If you use VM encryption, what happens is that if I have a VM and I move it out of an encrypted state, what happens is I cannot start it anymore. It's encrypted, and I can't start it outside of that encryption realm. So to wrap things up, let's conclude. What we've talked about is that domain controller virtualization is 100% supported, both by VMware and Microsoft. Active Directory is multi-master, distributed, low resources, makes it ideal to virtualize. And both the recommended practice for Microsoft for virtual and physical domain controllers are identical. So that applies to time synchronization, security, DNS, availability, all that stuff. If you still have domain controllers that run Windows Server 2008 or Windows Server 2008-02, please upgrade them to Windows Server 2012 or up, so you can have domain controller safeguards, and you can have domain controller cloning if you need to. And please upgrade to vSphere 6.5 or up if you want to use VM encryption. Now, if you like this session, please fill out the survey. Please don't hammer Deji for leaving, because he has a meeting with His Excellence, and that will be clear with all the announcement later today. And all that I would like to say now from both Deji and me is a big thank you.